Research methodology. Goals of scientific research. Scientific research in psychology has four interrelated goals. First, description. Second, prediction. Third, explanation, understanding. Four, application. Description. The first goal of scientific research is to carefully observe and identify regularly occurring sequences of events, including both stimuli or environmental events and responses or behavioral events. Researchers are often interested in describing the ways in which events are systematically related to one another. For example, do the height of the kids who play outdoor games increase more than those who play indoor games or do not play any outdoor games? Providing a clear, accurate description is an essential first step in any scientific endeavor. Without it, predictions cannot be made and explanations are meaningless. Prediction. Descriptions of events often provide a basis for prediction. The strength of the relationships allows predictions to be made with some degree of confidence. More formal and systematic predictions can be made by the testing of formal hypotheses using statistical methods. Hypotheses are frequently derived from theories or interrelated sets of concepts that explain a body of data and make predictions. Explanation, understanding. Another goal of scientific research is explanation. Explanation is achieved when the cause or causes of a phenomenon are identified. Cook and Campbell 1979 described three types of evidence drawn from the work of philosopher John Stuart Mill used to identify the cause of a behavior. First, covariation. Changes in the presumed cause must be related to changes in the presumed effect. When the cause is present, the effect occurs. When the cause is not present, the effect does not occur. Thus, the researcher introduces, remove, or change the level of a treatment or program to observe some change in the outcome measures. 2. Temporal precedence. The presumed cause must occur prior to the presumed effect. For example, we need to know whether inflation caused unemployment. 3. Elimination of alternative explanations. The presumed cause must be the only reasonable explanation for changes in the outcome measures, but sometimes it's possible that there is some other variable or factor that is causing the outcome. Thus, in that we can say that the presumed cause effect relationship is not correct. Any number of factors other than the treatment or program could cause changes in outcome measures. Campbell and Stanley 1966 and later Cook and Campbell 1979 list a number of common plausible alternative explanations or threats to internal validity. Thus, the third goal of scientific research is to explain the events that have been described. The researcher seeks to understand why the behavior occurs. Application. This final goal of scientific research is application. It involves the various ways of applying those principles of behavior learned through research. For example, the research on the factors influencing depression enables therapists to help people diagnosed with depression and so on. Research problem. Leedy 1989 defines a research problem as a procedure by which we attempt to find systematically and with the support of demonstrable fact the answer to a question or the resolution of a problem. According to Kurlinger, 1970, a research problem is the systematic, controlled, empirical, and critical investigation of hypothetical propositions about presumed relations among natural phenomena. There are two ways of stating the problem. First, research problems, typically a rather general overview of the problem with just enough information about the scope and purpose of the study to provide an initial understanding of the research. Two, research statements and or questions, more specific focus statements and questions that communicate in greater detail the nature of the study. In quantitative research, research problems tend to emphasize the need to explain, predict, or describe something. In qualitative research, the purpose focuses on exploring or understanding a phenomenon. Characteristics of good research questions. Research questions should be feasible, that is, capable of being investigated with available resources. 2. It should be clear and specific. 3. It should be significant or worthy of investigation. 4. It should refer to the problem or phenomenon. 5. It often, although not always, suggests a relationship to be investigated. 6. It addresses directly or indirectly some real problem in the world. 7. It is not biased in terminology or position. 8. It has multiple possible answers. 9. It takes ethical issues into consideration. 10. It offers something new to previous research and has the potential to suggest directions for future research. Sources of research problem. Research ideas and research problems originate from many sources. This includes the causal observation. This includes the casual observation of everyday life experiences or practical issues of life. Past research or related research literature review can be an excellent source of research ideas. Theory, that is, explanations of phenomena, can also be a source of research ideas. Besides that, personal interests and experiences can also be one the source of research problem. Hypothesis. According to Kallinger 1956, a hypothesis is a conjectural statement of the relation between two or more variables. Of a hypothesis may be precisely defined as a tentative proposition suggested as a solution to a problem or as an explanation of some phenomenon. Any useful hypothesis will enable predictions by reasoning, including deductive reasoning. It might predict the outcome of an experiment in a laboratory setting or the observation of a phenomenon in nature. The prediction may also invoke statistics and only talk about probabilities. This usually involves proposing a possible relationship between two variables, the independent variable what the researcher changes and the dependent variable what the research measures. A hypothesis should be stated clearly using appropriate terminology, testable state relationships between variables, limited in scope, focused. Types of hypothesis. There are three different types of hypothesis. First, null hypothesis. It states that there is no relationship between the two variables being studied. One variable does not affect the other. In other words, the null hypothesis states that there is no change or difference as a result of the independent variable. In statistical significance, the null hypothesis is often denoted H or read H naught and is generally assumed true until evidence indicates otherwise. 2. Alternate hypothesis states that there is a relationship between the two variables being studied. One variable has an effect on the other. In other words, the alternative hypothesis states that there is a change or difference as a result of the independent variable. The alternative hypothesis denoted by H or HA is the hypothesis. H1 or HA is the hypothesis which states that sample observations are influenced by some non-random cause. 3. One-tailed directional. A one-tailed directional hypothesis predicts the nature of the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. In other words, a one-tailed hypothesis specifies a directional relationship between groups. For example, girls are more intelligent than boys. 4. Two-tailed directional. A two-tailed hypothesis would predict that there was a difference between groups but would make no reference to the direction of the effect. For example, there will be a significant difference between the intelligence level of girls and boys. 5. Non-directional alternative hypothesis. A non-directional hypothesis is a type of alternative hypothesis used in statistical significance testing, sometimes called a two-tailed test. A test of a non-directional alternative hypothesis does not state the direction of the difference. It indicates only that a difference exists. In other words, a non-directional alternative hypothesis only concerned that null hypothesis is not true. Variables. A variable is a concept or abstract idea that can be described in measurable terms. In research, this term refers to the measurable characteristics, qualities, traits, or attributes of a particular individual, object, or situation being studied. Variables are generally used in psychology experiments to determine if changes to one thing result in changes to another. Types of variables. First, independent variable IV. Those variables which the experimenter manipulates, that is, changes to see its direct effect on the dependent variable. For example, in an experiment looking at the effects of stress on health, stress would be the independent variable. Researchers are trying to determine if changes to the independent variable stress level result in significant changes to the dependent variable, the health. Dependent variable DV, those variables which are measured by the experimental after making changes to the independent variables that are assumed to affect the dependent variable. For example, in a study looking at how stress level impacts the health, the dependent variable would be the participant's health score. Three extraneous variables. Extraneous variables are undesirable variables that influence the relationship between independent and dependent variables. Thus, the researcher tried to control all the other variables that could affect the DV. It is dependent variable. There are two basic types of extraneous variables. A. Participant variables. These factors can include background differences, mood, anxiety, intelligence, awareness, and other characteristics that are unique to each person. B. Situational variables. These extraneous variables are related to things in the environment that may impact how each participant responds, noise, pollution, temperature, etc. If, however, a variable cannot be controlled for, it becomes what is known as a confounding variable. This type of variable can have an impact on the dependent variable or can hamper the actual result of the study. Methods of psychological research. Methods of psychological research. Experimental method. In experimental method, the researcher or experimenter studies the effect of independent variable which is controlled and manipulated by the experimenter on dependent variable. The change in behavior measured by the researcher. In an experimental study, following characteristics should be included in the study. First, the independent variable must be completely controlled. 2. The sample of research participants subjects must be randomly chosen. 3. The subjects must be assigned randomly to conditions. A condition refers to the group of subjects who receive different values of independent variable. There are three types of experiments: laboratory control experiments, field experiments, and quasi or natural experiment. First, laboratory controlled experiments. A laboratory experiment is an experiment conducted under highly controlled conditions and therefore accurate measurements are possible. The researcher decides the place, time, and circumstances under which research study will take place using a standardized procedure. Laboratory experiments allow for precise control of variables. However, it is not always possible to control all the variables. There may be other variables at work which the experimenter is unaware of. The purpose of control is to enable the experimenter to isolate the independent variable to observe its effect on the dependent variable. The advantage of experimental method is that it can be easily replicated because a standardized procedure is used in this. The other advantage is that it allows establishing a cause and effect relationship. Because this involves the deliberate manipulation of one variable while trying to keep all other variables constant. As far as limitation is concerned, the artificiality of the setting may produce unnatural behavior that does not reflect real life. This means it would not be possible to generalize the findings to a real life setting. A further difficulty with the experimental method is demand characteristics. It means if a participant knows they are in an experiment, they may seek cues about how they think they are expected to behave. Two field experiments. A field experiment is the one that is conducted in the real life environment of the participants. In field experiments, the participants are not usually aware that they are participating in an experiment. The experimenter still manipulates the independent variable, but in a real life setting, so cannot really control extraneous variables. The advantage of this type of study is that it has higher ecological validity than a lab experiment, as because of its natural setting. The behavior in the field experiment is more likely to reflect the real life. Other advantage is that there is less likelihood of demand characteristics affecting the results, as participants may not know they are being studied. The disadvantage, on the other hand, is that there is less control over extraneous variables that might bias the results. Other limitation is that in field experiments it is not usually possible to gain informed consent from the participants and it is difficult to debrief the participants. 3. Quasi or natural experiments. A quasi experiment is the one which is conducted in the everyday, that is real life environment of the participants. But here the experimenter has no control over the independent variable IV as it occurs naturally in real life. These experiments are often called natural experiments. One of the strengths of quasi a natural experiment is that because of its natural setting, the behavior in a natural experiment is more likely to reflect life real, that is very high ecological validity. In a quasi experiment, the researcher takes advantage of pre-existing conditions such as age, sex, or an event that the researcher has no control over, such as a participant's occupation. As disadvantage, these types of experiments are more expensive and time consuming than the lab experiments. Also, as there is no control of experimenter over the extraneous variables, it might bias the results. Hence, replication also becomes difficult. Case study method. The case study method involves an in-depth study of an individual or group of individuals. It often involves simply observing what happens to or reconstructing the case history of a single participant or group of individuals. In this method, almost every aspect of an individual or subject's life and previous happenings or history is taken into account to determine the patterns and causes of the behavior. The researcher collects data about the subject through interviews, direct observation, psychological testing, or examination of documents and archival records about the subject. There are usually two types of case study methods: prospective and retrospective. Prospective, a type of case study in which a participant or group of participants is observed in order to determine outcomes such as the development of a disease during the study period and relates this to other factors such as suspected risk or protection factors. In this type of case study, some criteria are established and cases fitting the criteria are included as they become available. In a study on a group of smokers and non-smokers over a time, determining or finding out which ones eventually develop cancer and which do not is an example of prospective study or method. Retrospective, a type of case study which looks backwards and examines exposures to suspected risk or protection factors in relation to an outcome that is established at the start of the study. In other words, it involves looking at historical information or establishing criteria for selecting cases from historical records for inclusion in the study. Many valuable case control studies are good examples of retrospective method. A study is called case control when cases or disease subjects and controls or comparable non-disease subjects are sampled from respective populations and then assessed on their risk factor exposure status. In case where we first locate a group of participants with cancer and identify which are smokers and which are not, as is an example of retrospective study or method. As an advantage, case study method provides detailed or qualitative information about the participant. Also, it provides insight for further research. Case studies tend to be conducted on rare cases where large samples of similar participants are not available. The disadvantage of case study method is that the data collected cannot necessarily be generalized to the wider population. Some case studies are not scientific, and it is also very difficult to draw a definite cause effect from these types of studies. Methods of data collection. Observation. According to Week, 1968, observation involves brutally selecting, recording, and encoding behavior for empirical aims of description and development of theory. In terms of scientific observation, it is the systematic process of recording the behavioral patterns of people, objects, and occurrences as they are witnessed. In psychology, observation, particularly participant observation, has been used as a tool for collecting data about people, processes, and cultures in qualitative research. The qualitative approaches to observation can provide rich, detailed description unconstrained by the predetermined concepts and categories. They are therefore particularly useful for describing the complexity of what is observed and for generating hypotheses about it and about relationships between different factors or elements. On the other hand, in quantitative observational studies, the researcher typically spends time in the same situation as the person or persons they are observing, recording what that person does and what happens to them. Types of observation. First, covert observation. Covert Observations involve the researcher not informing members of the group the reason for their presence, keeping their true intentions secret. There could be ethical problems or deception and consent with this particular method of observation. To overt observation in this type of observation, the participants are aware that they being a part of research study and they know they are being observed. An advantage of this type of observation is that it allows the researcher to be honest with the participants, thus avoiding problematic ethical issues such as deception or lack of informed consent. 3. Naturalistic observation. This type of observation allows the researcher to observe and record the behavior exactly as it occurs in the real world. In other words, the behavior is being observed in a more or less natural setting without any intervention. It means the investigator does not manipulate or control the situation has not been initiated or created by the investigator. Naturalistic observation helps to establish the external validity of research findings. For controlled observation, in this behavior is observed under controlled laboratory conditions. Control observation allowed the researchers to obtain a base value that could be trusted with regard to the experiment. 5. Participant observation. In participant observation, the researcher or investigator actively participates in the activities of the group to be observed. The procedure of participant observation is often unstructured and the identity of the observer is often not known to the other members of the group. It allows researchers to observe behaviors in situations that are not usually open to scientific observation. However, participant observers may sometimes lose their objectivity or may unduly influence the individuals whose behavior they are recording. 6. Non-participant observation. Non-participant observation is usually structured and the investigation observes the behavior of the participants in a natural setting but does not remain a participant or member of the group being observed. The data obtained by this type of observation are more reliable and representative. However, the non-participant observation fails to record natural context of social settings the way participant observation does. Interview. An interview is a data collection technique that involves oral questioning of respondents, either individually or as a group. In simple words, interviews are usually one-on-one between the interviewer and participant meant to gather information on a specific set of topics. Using oral questions, interviews can give us both quantitative and qualitative data about participants' thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Quantitative data can obtained by asking close-ended questions which have specific answers to choose among and can be categorized and numerically analyzed. However, while obtaining qualitative data, the interviewer asks open-ended questions to respondents and in return he answers to these questions in his or her own words. Types on interviews. There are usually two types of interview, namely formal interview and informal interview. First, formal interview, also called structured interview, include pre-planned set of questions written down on a piece of paper and the interviewer asks those questions verbally and note down the answers given by the respondents. In fact, each candidate is asked similar questions in a predetermined format and thus generalization can be done on the basis of the result obtained from the population or sample population. Structured interview can be conducted through various modes like face-to-face interview over the telephone, video phone, and the internet. As an advantage, formal or structured interview are fairly quick to conduct and is also easy to replicate as same set of closed questions are used which are easy to quantify. On the other hand, the limitation of these types of tests is that they are not flexible and are expensive and time consuming. Two informal interview, also known as unstructured interview, are much more casual and unrehearsed. In this type of interview, there is no predetermined set of questions, nor is there any present order of questions to be asked by the interviewer. Unplanned spontaneous questions are a key feature of the unstructured interview. For example, the media interview with celebrities is a common example of unstructured interview. The advantage of unstructured interview is that it is more flexible and generates qualitative data through the use of open questions. As a limitation, there is scope for personal bias of the interviewer in this type of interview. Also, the data obtained from informal interview are difficult to quantify and analyze. Questionnaire. A questionnaire is a data collection technique to For collecting and recording information about a particular issue of interest, it consists of a predetermined set of questions with clear instruction for administration. It can be administered through mails, telephone using face to face interviews, postal and electronic mediums. Postal and electronic questionnaires are known as self completion questionnaires, for example, that is, respondents complete them by themselves in their own time. Face to face and telephonic questionnaires are used by interviewers to ask a standard set of questions and record the participants' responses. Questionnaires that are used by interviewers in this way are sometimes known as interview schedules. Types of questionnaire. The commonly used questionnaires in behavioral researches are first fixed response questionnaire. This type of questionnaire includes those statements of questions which have fixed number of opinions or choice of response like yes or no. An example of this category includes a statement like, do you feel there is a need of strict laws against the sexual harassment cases in India? Yes, no. The respondent is asked to choose one option that best suits his or her. These tests can also be used in scale format where respondent should decide to rate the situation in along the scale continuum similar to Likert questions. Such type of questionnaire is also known as closed form questionnaire or pre-coded type of questionnaire. One advantage of fixed response questionnaire is that it is easy to administer and can be easily scored and coded. It is less time consuming as a disadvantage due to restriction of answering question in yes or no format. Sometimes the respondent becomes biased in answering the questions. 2. Open-ended questionnaire. This type of questionnaire cannot be answered with a simple yes or no. In fact, the questions are sometimes phrased as a statement which requires a response, or it consists of questions that require short or lengthy answers by the participants. For example, tell me something about yourself. How would you like to suggest the ways to improve the education system of India? An advantage of open-ended questionnaire is that the respondent is free to express his or ideas or views and thus helps in avoiding the bias that may result from suggesting responses to individuals. A bias which may occur in the case of close-ended questions. Open-ended questions can also be proved useful if you do not know the possible answers to questions or for gathering insightful or unexpected information. However, the limitation of these types of question is that it is time consuming and difficult to analyze and interpret the responses of the participant. Test. A psychological test is a standardized procedure to measure quantitatively and qualitatively one or more aspects of human traits or attributes including achievement and ability, personality and neurological functioning, etc. Mostly these tests are objective in nature. However, objective for the some subjective interpretation, the projective tests are widely used. Psychological tests are administered in a variety of settings, including preschools, primary and secondary schools, colleges and universities, hospitals, outpatient healthcare settings, and social agencies. They come in a variety of formats, including written, verbal, or non-verbal and computer administered. Types of tests. First, individual versus group tests. Individual tests are those types of tests which are administered on a single person at a time. These types are usually preferred by psychologists in clinics, hospitals and other school and college settings. A common example of individual test is course block design test. A group test, on the other hand, are those tests that can be administered on more than one person or in a group at a time. Most testing today is administered as a group test, considering the many benefits that are associated with these tests. Bell adjustment inventory is an example of group tests. 2. Power versus speed test. A power test is the one which allows the participants to complete the test or answer the items without any time boundation or deadline. Usually in such type of test, the item difficulty level increases the item by item. Power tests tend to be demonstrating that how much the knowledge or information the participant actually has. Intelligence test and aptitude belongs to the power test category. Speed test, on the other hand, have time limit boundation and the participant has to complete the items as soon as possible within the limited time frame only. Items are comparatively easy in these type of tests and the item difficulty level are more or less of the same degree. The primary objective of speed test is to measure the person's ability to process information quickly and accurately within a set period of time. Speed tests are suitable for testing visual perception, numerical facility, and other abilities related to vocational success. Tests of psychomotor abilities, for example, eye-hand coordination often involve speed. 3. Verbal versus non-verbal. Verbal tests are those tests which entirely contains verbal material dealing with vocabulary, general information, reading or writing. These types of tests is also called paper pencil test because a participant has to write down on a piece of paper while answering the items of the test. Binet test 1905, Stanford Binet test, Otis test, etc. are example of verbal tests. As far as non-verbal tests are concerned, the items in these types of tests involves no language. The items in the test, however, present the problem with the help of pictures, drawing, block patterns, etc. Raven progressive matrices are a good example of non-verbal test. Characteristics of a good test. A good scientific test should be objective in nature, that is, the items of the test and its scoring system should be objective. Besides that, a test should be reliable and valid too, and should be guided by certain norms. Above all, it should be practicable in use. Thank you.